Good morning, everyone. This is Rayvn Manuel. I am the government chair for the application development working group that is sponsored by ATARC. Today, we are going to be discussing new techniques, best practices, and a prescriptive approach for how government agencies can reduce software supply chain risks within their applications, as well as comply with the new government regulations. With me, I am joined by David Wray from Microfocus and Robert Ficcaglia. Go ahead, Robert. Tell me what your last name is. Ficcaglia. Ficcaglia.
Since you're gonna record, I'm gonna take this chance to tell you, my battery, of course, is gonna go low, so I'm gonna go off camera and go get a plug.
Okay. Cool. At Sunstone Secure to discuss the why, the need for the executive order and NIST guidance for software supply chain risk. So I'm going to start with David, since Robert's going to get a power to plug in his laptop, and we're going to get started with you, David. And so tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for your organization, and how does this impact your work that you're doing?
Sure. Well, first, Rayvn, thank you for having me on the podcast. And as you mentioned, I'm a public sector CTO for Microfocus Software, and we're people aren't familiar with Microfocus. We're a very large, software producer, one of the largest in the world from a pure play, software perspective. We have a lot of products that we push out every year. So as you can imagine, in the executive order when it released on May 12th. Section 4 was pretty much dedicated to software producers, like Microsoft and Oracle and Microfocus. And a lot of the tools we actually produce on our end are for developers, for load testing, for, scanning code, for source code check-in, for that entire DevOps, process or tool chain. So for us, it kind of really hit home. We realized that the government is starting to implement regulations, and they're going to score, vendors, like an Energy Star rating, on their ability to secure the software supply chain, how we produce and develop software, and what components, we put in our software. So we've been working for about the last decade to really reduce insider threat, and improve our supply chain. But we hadn't had official guidance. So now we do. There's going to be requirements for the software bill of materials, where we're going to have to drill into the dependencies of how our products are built, and then communicate in a timely fashion on critical vulnerabilities or events when they occur to the government. And we're doing that already today, but there was not regulation that required it. So what we're really going to have now is not only regulation, but an audit, I would imagine, starting next year in 2022. That's what the executive order said, where they'll start ranking producers and software producers. But what a lot of people didn't see in the executive order was that it also mandated that OMB create guidance and that NIST create guidance working with SASA, which is what was just produced last week. We have a draft software security maturity model from NIST that is there's public comments are due tomorrow on that from industry and from agencies, and then OMB also produced some draft guidance on how to align and secure the zero trust environment for applications, which is, they have some very specific comments, which again, after they provide feedback, that will most likely become a memorandum from OMB, which will agencies will have to comply with. So there's a whole lot there. So I would imagine we're going to continue to really put a lot of emphasis on our software factory and our digital software factory internally, so that we can have a lot of compliance and automation around the steps that we use today, to build software, and so we can communicate a little more effectively with our customers, and especially the government, on how secure that is. So hopefully that answered your question. Oh, you're on mute, Rayvn. Sorry.
Sorry, my mouse got away from me. that actually did answer the question. Thanks, David. Robert, your turn. Who are you? Where do you work? How does this impact you?
Yes, hi, Robert Ficcaglia. I work at Sunstone Secure. I'm the CTO there, and we build tools primarily for software companies looking to do business in the federal space. I'm here today representing the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, the CNCF, and we are a subgroup under the Linux Foundation. And so this is a nonprofit organization that is the custodian and administrator for many different open source projects, but the one that probably most listeners have heard of is a project called Kubernetes. And that is a container orchestration platform that powers many of the clouds and growing fast. So we interact daily with all the large cloud providers and increasingly with government agencies and public sector users. In fact, in my role there as co-chair for the policy working group, I have a number of folks from NIST and the various agencies that jump in and out of those work group meetings. In our CNCF security working group, we also audit and assess other open source projects. And we see a lot of interest from the agency community and the public sector community. So much so that I started a public sector channel in the CNCF community space. We use Slack primarily. So we're trying to really, at least my group is trying to align our efforts in service to that growing community. And why all this matters to me personally in that role is that we in the open source community, of course, all have day jobs, and we've all had a history in either public sector or commercial industry software. So we've been wrestling with these problems for a number of years, but in the open source community, you're building the software without mandates, without guidance. It's a bit of the Wild West. And then suddenly you're finding that your software is being used to build important platforms in service to the government, in service to businesses and creating jobs. And more, this is infrastructure is under attack. So, we look very introspectively as a community on not only adding great features and new capabilities, but how we're going to protect those capabilities out in the world. So supply chain, in many cases, we are the supply chain, right? We are the libraries, the packages that many commercial products rely on, whether it's, anything from Linux, the operating system, the kernel, to those higher level, microservice platforms. Most of that is in some way or another touching open source today. So for a number of months now, we've had a focus on things that are contained in the executive order, supply chain, software bill of materials. When that EO came out, actually the Kubernetes community rallied within days and had an SBOM produced. Managing images, managing source control, managing security scanning in the pipelines. These were all topics that we were discussing prior to the EO. So I think we're uniquely positioned to serve as subject matter experts in this area, and we're looking forward to help the broader community address these problems.
That's awesome. I actually didn't. I am also part of the Linux, a member. And so, but I didn't know about your sub work group. So I'm going to join because I am really new to all of this. This is, as a developer, I am the senior application developer, but I'm also the person that has to advise my leadership on things that we need to be doing, right? And so I need to know. So the first thing I would want to know is, why is this now a thing? Why, like, Robert, you did mention that there was no guidance and there was no, and David, you did too, that there was no guidance, there was no rules around this. It seems to me that this has to do with security because, Robert, you said that infrastructure is under attack, right? Government has always been security conscious, right? Theoretically, has always been, security conscious. So you would think that this would already be embedded in the life cycle and software, anybody dealing with federal government, right? So why now? Why is there an executive order? Why is there a need for the two guidance from NIST and OMB? And I'll start with you, David. to give you a chance, Robert,
Well,
to figure it
sure.
out.
I think although this has been occurring for some time, you know, obviously the breach we had with SolarWinds was critical across government and commercial agencies. But there's also been in the last year since that over a 600% increase in attacks as part of the software supply chain, and especially with a lot of the open source tools that Robert mentioned, because it exposed vulnerabilities. You know, if we can attack the software supply chain, we can get access to critical accounts and critical data, especially in government and commercial organizations. So we've seen several for Microsoft, for code coverage tools, for testing tools. And although all these are tracked, you know, it really, you know, shined a light on a problem that the government needed to address. So, you know, I think that combined with the critical infrastructure attacks that occurred with Colonial Pipeline and other things that are occurring from a cyber perspective, it really pressed the administration to do something now with the executive order. That was just the beginning. I think in the executive order, there were directives and dates assigned, and there was over, you know, 35 directives to CISA, for example, you know, around this, and they have to address them. So we're starting to see things come out now of exactly what the effects will be and what the policies will be put on agencies. So in the past, there were things like in FISMA, I think there was a requirement to scan code once a year, you know, on the federal side. In DoD, in the NDAA, there were more strict guidelines on how they should do and build software and how they incorporate software. There's always been approved vendors list, and we've had things like that in government, but there's never been any rules on how you build your software, right? Some loose guidance that was in the Buy America Act and ITAR, you know, so you could develop it all over the world as long as it's manufactured here in the US, you were okay. And that's still the case, you know, today. So this is providing some more instructions on, you know, how we build our software in industry, and it's also going to become requirements for agencies for how they build their software, which to me is a much bigger problem. You know, sure, industry provides critical software for agencies, but agencies have thousands of applications which they push out all the time, and there's very little guidance on how they're built, you know, in government. There's no enterprise services for developers. There's very few enterprise-based source code repositories. Each program or project has their own. There's very few policies to review in government, you know, code and do design walkthroughs that are formal, and lockdown or insider threat capability for developers. All those things, you know, don't exist. So if you look at all the attack vectors in the software build chain, that's what the guidance is meant to lock down. And so the best practices, I think, are pretty welcome. They've certainly been out there for a while. It's not new. It's just there's never been policy around it.
And you need policy for that. Robert, before you answer that, David, I would, just for the people who are not used to all of the acronyms, what is CISA and what is FISMA? Can you just tell me?
Oh, sure. The Federal Information Security Management Act, I believe that's what the M is for. And
okay.
They were talking on the Hill this week. They interviewed the DHS, the new agency in DHS, which is CISA, that's giving them authority to help critical infrastructure customers in the government, as well as giving them authority on rules around supply chain risk and analysis across agencies. So, you know, CISA was basically created a few years ago. It's a relatively new agency, but they're getting more and more responsibility in this space. I think the guidance will probably come from OMB, but it'll be based on best practices from NIST and then how CISA believes it should be secured. So they're all working together. So.
Cool. Robert, what I want you to do before you answer is to really shortly, from your perspective, what is the supply chain? You're the software supply chain, right? For somebody who's new and doesn't have a clue at non-leadership level that knows what that is, explain what that means, define it, I guess.
Well, I'll start at the highest level and then maybe drill down a little bit into it. But succinctly, I mean, the supply chain is every bit of technology that goes into software platform or software product that is critical to your operations, critical to your mission, critical to your business, or critical to your open source project. So that could include, everything from the developer tools you're using to the source code control system that has those bits and bytes that you compile into software or interpreted on the cloud platform, all the way through to third-party dependencies. And I think this is where most of the attention is being pointed. What are the third-party dependencies that are outside of my control? I didn't necessarily choose them. I picked something off the shelf. Maybe it was a language, maybe it was a cloud, maybe it was an application, and embedded in that, with or without my knowledge, is a whole array of other software that I might never have heard of, thought about, or cared about. Everything from keeping time in sync to managing memory and disks, or things like that. So I think to the non-practitioner, the best way to think about it is, from a risk-based perspective, what risks am I inviting into my business? And does somebody in the organization who understands all of this stuff, does somebody really have visibility on these risks and how to manage them? And as a leader, am I funding the mandate to keep all of this secure and giving you the people, the tools, and the resources necessary? So I think that's one key takeaway, because I think this executive order and some of the guidance we're getting is great, but I do feel like without the right training, without the right skills, without the right funding, it's going to be difficult for organizations who are enthusiastic about meeting this goal and achieving success. They're kind of set up for failure.
So why now is it a thing again? I mean, to me, it just, what you just right, when you broke it down, for me, I actually look at security. Like we can't even, we have a TRB process that looks at security. So why is it now a thing?
So I think there's a couple of changes over the last 20 years where security 20 years ago was about controlling static assets, fixed bundles of software that you more or less had full control over. If you were producing it in-house, you were familiar with source control systems, you were familiar with change management systems, ticketing systems, you had code reviews, you'd have design reviews, you'd have FEMA reviews, you'd have testing, quality assurance. So you really had a sense of, soup to nuts. You had control over the process, over the people. It was probably entirely captive. Maybe you used some expert consultants and you brought those in, and they went through training and they had to sign all sorts of paperwork. Or you bought it from a vendor, and then as part of that due diligence process, you check their bona fides. Did they have certifications? Were they lab tested? Did they go through a FIPS process? Did they, what common control, common criteria? So there were all sorts of paperwork processes to give you an assurance of control of those assets. Now, fast forward, maybe 10 years, and as the cloud emerged, people had to make this decision of how much control do I want to relinquish to gain operational benefits. And I think many organizations are just starting to struggle with that and are continuing that journey still. That's not complete, but those of us now, 10 years later, who have embraced the cloud wholeheartedly for those operational gains, for those efficiencies, now taking a really strong look at, okay, what risks did I inherit? What can I trust, and how can I build a proof, if you will, around that trust? Because all the things that David mentioned, there clearly are attacks. And I would argue those have always been there. I think now that the cloud platforms are more central to everyone's daily lives, they're far more visible. And I think there's far more leverage on the attacker side. You can attack once and harvest value many times by attacking the cloud platforms, by attacking these shared infrastructure tools. It's no longer investing time and energy on one particular target and then having to move on to the next target from scratch. You're really leveraging the investment the attacker makes in building tools and analyzing systems and understanding the data flows, that's all reusable. And I think all of us as software practitioners at some point in our career recognize the value of reuse. Good software that can be reused, good practices that can be reused are highly leverageable. And we're seeing that on the attack side. They're leveraging tools and techniques and processes and frameworks and, in a sense, productizing attack. And that's why I think now, at this point in history, this is coming to a head, and why not just government, we see this in industry as well. Large organizations are starting to look very carefully at their supply chain of vendors and software tools and asking them the same tough questions. How do you know that your supply chain and your third-party dependencies are secure? So I think that's why now, because of that confluence of cloud and that on the attack side, leveraging and reusing these capabilities almost in a productized way.
So from an open source, I'll stick with you for a moment, and then I'll go to you, David, for the same question. Is the guidance that the open source community that you're receiving from NIST and OMB, is it detailed enough for you to, for one, the public sector, those agencies to actually be able to draft internal policies and implement processes, as well as for the open source community? Is it enough?
Well, I think the challenge, the cultural challenge in the open source community is, I think there is a natural rebelliousness and kind of the desire not to have policies and procedures for their own sake. So I think, one half of the community, I'm just arbitrarily picking half, one side of the community would look at policies and procedures as a barrier to true security. And, at the end of the day, they might argue that, if it's secure, you don't really need the policies and procedures. So let's worry about the security part first. On the other side, I think you'd have those who definitely see the value of getting everybody on the same page, clearly articulating the goals and the priorities so that we can take a more risk-based approach, because you can't boil the ocean, you can't solve all the problems tomorrow. So you do need to prioritize where you focus your attention and where you address specific security deficiencies. So I think it's a challenge in the open source community to try to get these two camps together, and there are probably many different fractured subcamps with nuanced perspectives. So I'm grossly oversimplifying. But it's a natural tension in the community to try to kind of move fast and break things, as we've heard, and on the other side, try to slow it down and look holistically at what we're creating and who's using it and what are the risks. I think that's a problem we face. And I think the good news is that we have folks on either side of the equation that are very engaged, volunteering their time, or aligning their company, if they're part of a commercial entity, aligning their entire company's strategy around the open source community in solving some of these problems. So I'm happy to drill down into the how a little bit next, but
that'll be our next podcast.
Yeah.
David, go ahead. Sorry, Robert, what did you say?
That can be an entire podcast at each layer.
Exactly. David, how do you feel responding to Robert and in your own experience?
Sure. Well, I agree with Robert. I think it's over the last decade or so, the focus of security has mainly been on the perimeter and on protecting the network. And from a government perspective, it's mainly around compliance, right? And compliance with security controls that NIST recommended are in place. But they're shifting in government now to more of a risk-based approach, and that's what the Zero Trust effort is all about. That was recently produced, is shifting your focus to prevent risks. And one of the areas that is of high risk is software, right? And I think that's because of the changes with moving software to the cloud, software as a service, and how software is built. It's built basically by components. A lot of times the developers don't really understand the components they're using. They just want one piece of it. And so they pull this plugin down, they pull a library down, they use it, they get their code done. But they really don't understand the code they use to develop the software with. And this happens on the commercial side as well as within government. And because of the exposures and the recent attacks that occurred in the software supply chain, now everybody seems to really all of a sudden, care, right? About, is my software secure? Before I install this on my network, is it going to create problems? With the recent attack that occurred with SolarWinds, the problem existed for months before it was detected. It was very, very difficult to detect because everybody assumed the software was secure because it was signed. So the question is, how did a vendor have software that was signed, which means the agency assumed that it was secure because it came from the producer, therefore we're going to use it. And so that shared trust model broke down. And so now the government wants to fix it. They're basically not trusting anymore. They're saying, we're going to rank vendors on their ability to produce software. We're going to put policy in place to make sure that people understand the components that they're using when they're developing software and make sure they're secure. And to your question about guidance, I think the NIST guidance is great. It's a series of practice areas that outlines more or less different things you can do in each practice area to better secure your software development lifecycle. How that's interpreted by industry or by government is still yet to be determined, right? Whether we'll have policies based on that. But the guidance has been around for a long time. They simply referenced existing secure software, build security in, the CMMI, software maturity models that are out there. And they reference them as well as referencing existing NIST risk management frameworks already in place and pull it together just to explain how you can better secure software. But they did add some unique things in there, which, Robert, I'd love your comments on. One was they want commercial producers like us to flow down acquisition contract language to the people that we purchase components from, to make sure that they're compliant with the same, standards that we're signing up to be compliant with across the government. I don't know how we do that from an open source perspective. Who accepts that liability? Who signs it, right? And so we use a ton of open source, and as you mentioned, Robert, most of the libraries, we've moved everything to microservices with Kubernetes and across our ITOM portfolio, for example, and they're pure cloud-based, cloud architecture-based applications today. So if those contracts have to change, I'm just curious, which vendor is going to sign up, for that liability to provide that software to us so that we can comply with, if there is regulation in the government, that comes out from the NIST guidance, which I anticipate there will be, how we can actually comply with our open source components. Otherwise, we'll have to buy a commercial, components.
Right. So I'll address that on a couple of levels. First and foremost, I think contractually, there's never going to be an open source organization, even at the scale of Linux Foundation or CNCF, that's going to sign, a government contract or industry contract and take responsibility. It's just outside of the foundational principles of what open source is about. But that said, there are a number of commercial entities who are very aligned with either specific open source projects or are kind of compiling or aggregating all of these components into a holistic platform that can either be installed in your on-prem environment as your on-prem cloud, or installed on the actual public clouds or government environments in those clouds, or some hybrid model. And I think that's where you'll see those organizations, some are large, some are very small and niche-y. They're going to want to work with an open source community that has actual structure behind it. So rather than just pulling random code off of GitHub, going to the Linux Foundation or CNCF or any number of Apache and other groups that put together really a process, a formalized community with we have all of our regulation bylaws, procedural rules, all encoded and transparent. And in our group, where we look specifically at the projects, we mentor them through this maturation from incubation, sandbox, fully graduated, and we have a delineated number of checks that they have to pass through, including a semi-formal review at the beginning, and then a very formal code audit and penetration test, if you will, security audit at the very end for graduation. And that's where the membership dues that the corporate entities provide to the Linux Foundation and CNCF pay for that external audit. It's driven by the community. In fact, I'm part of that effort for the Kubernetes project itself. And we work very closely with the best of auditors and practitioners. So we get the best of both worlds. We get the open source community guiding it without bias and with an eye towards the broader use of the platform. But we really get to pick the best practitioners who can assess the security. So all of that is in service to having essentially a brand name behind the open source that your company, your agency will be using. And that there is a very transparent process and artifacts that can be used to build a trust proof for your organization. So whether that will rise to the level needed, David, for the contracting process, I think that has yet to be tested, and there's a lot of discovery there. But it's certainly better than not having that infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree. And we don't have a contract with any of our open source providers today, right? There's no acquisition. It's so in a lot of ways, we could make sure all the acquisitions we have made for the components we're purchasing are in our SBOM and we flow down clauses to, but not for open source. I think that may be acceptable. And maybe the government will help with providing a list of approved or vetted versions or signed versions of a binary artifactory that we could leverage, so that we get the approved, tested, vetted versions you're talking about, Robert. Because I think that's really where I've seen the most risk is when you're doing builds, you should be pulling from a third-party vetted a binary artifactory, right? Or from your approved set of code. It shouldn't just go out to the internet and pull down the latest. So that's a little scary, and a lot of times that happens, because the developers have just built their build scripts that way to give me the latest version. Check it out at GitHub, and that's a little scary, especially when this software is being used for a critical component. So I think we'll have obviously some better controls as a producer over that. We do that today internally. We're doing that. We have our own secure binary artifactory, but the government may want to produce something as well that we draw from. That would be one way to control it.
Yeah, I think that you've hit the nail on the head, is that the point of distribution. I think there's going to be a need for organizations or the government to define what the requirements are for that. So how do we maintain provenance? How was this artifact generated? Is it do we have a proof? Is it falsifiable? Is there repudiation? Do we have that SBOM? Do we know what those dependencies are? And that doesn't need to be a central global repository that everybody pulls from. In fact, I would argue against that. I would say that you want to have the architecture and the design and the plans defined for how to project that proof and that trust so that anyone could build that artifactory and then make that available to their community, rather than have one single entity that everyone starts to trust again. Because now we're just setting up another single point of failure, and it makes it a very attractive target for attackers. And if any one step fails, then you've got a real problem. So I'd encourage the process of building that artifactory be as transparent and documented as possible, and build in those controls in a regenerative way. And a kind of example of this is a project called SigStore, and they had a very transparent, open, master key ceremony, all captured on a webinar, and all the participants were transparent about who they work for, what their roles are. So it can all be reconstructed either de novo if you wanted to create a separate SigStore, or you could anyone could audit that process and see all the binary artifacts and who was involved from day zero. So I think if we can build those levels of provable trusted entities for distribution, that would go a long way.
Robert, and I'm going to ask you, David, because you do have developers in your organization, But from the open source community, Robert, how do you see that adding all of these considerations, adding them to, and we're going to talk about from the development, because that's where it starts, right? How will it impact speed, speed of being able to get the software to the end, like to be able to be produced, as well as skill for the developers? How is that going to impact that?
Yeah, I mean, the impacts are multi-dimensional. So as a practitioner, I can see this, a couple of different ways. This is now a whole lot of work I have to do that I never had to do before, and I might feel helpless or inadequately prepared to understand all these concepts. What is a CI/CD pipeline? What is DevOps? What's a container? I might never have had to worry about this. I'm a C programmer, and that's what I've been doing the last 20 years, and I do it very well. On the flip side, there's so many great tools that lift the burden from you as an individual programmer and make this process easier. One example that all of us as developers have probably struggled through: code reviews, right? So it used to be that you'd print out the code and everyone would sit around the table, and it was this very clunky process. Then we got to screen share, and we could at least kind of hover the mouse over things in front of a projector. Today you've got these tools that will pop up and scaffold those reviews and pinpoint code smells or security hotspots. And it was just an aha moment for me personally when starting to use these tools. Wow, I no longer have to swap in a memory all the hundreds, if not thousands, of non-contextualized concerns that are swimming around in the head, and I'm trying to bring this to bear on this very specific block of code that we're reviewing, typically, between other meetings when there are lots of competing pressures. I now have this tool that's going to surface the most important things to spend my time on. And I think that's where we're going to see that trend continue, where the developers are going to get, it doesn't have to be fancy AI, but that is coming. We're going to get more and more help around focusing our very valuable time and attention on the right areas and making sure we're prioritizing in a risk-based way where we should be applying our gray matter. And I think that's something that eventually developers will embrace, and they'll see that, look, I'm making a real contribution demonstrably to the security of this product or platform, and the tools are helping me do that. I might have to learn a few more concepts. May have to broaden my skill set into areas that I've never had to work with before, but some tool and some platform will have my back and help me do that effectively.
Hold on to that thought of tools, David, because your products have to be more timely than open source, right? Because open source can actually produce when they get there. But for you, a product development organization, how is this going to impact your development lifecycle?
Sure. Well, we started actually about 4 years ago building a digital software factory, and the goal was to innovate faster and improve our release cadence. And we went from 1 or 2 annual releases of our software to monthly releases, and we transitioned how we're building software with microservices and containers, and building a digital software factory that supported CI/CD and automation. And we had a lot of support from developers, but we had mostly local excellence. We didn't have enterprise visibility or excellence, and that's why we wanted to develop this larger, digital software factory. When we started putting policies in place, that's when we started getting resistance from all the development teams. We didn't want to put a burden on those developers to all these extracurricular activities that wasn't part of their development tasks, like being a security analyst for code dependencies. And what we found is they don't do a very good job at things that are outside their wheelhouse, and they'll just simply do a compliance check. They try and finish it as quickly as they can so they can get back to writing code. And that wasn't good enough for us, right? We really wanted to strengthen that whole process. So we ended up developing enterprise services for developers and having system owners and business owners assigned to critical pieces in that software build process, like security scanning, So we're today across 5,000 developers, 300 products, we're doing 20 to 30 million lines of code we scan daily. That's not something you can just ask the development teams to do. We had to provide it as an enterprise service. We had to create a wiki. We had to have assurance that it was being done. We had to have audits, hold people accountable. And probably the most important thing is we needed executive sponsors, in the organization that wanted to help us drive this change. So it was a huge effort, and it wasn't necessarily a technology effort. It was a policy adoption, change management effort to get everybody on board. And the only way it was successful for us was to remove that burden from the developers and provide things as a service so that you were adding value. And if you weren't adding value and making their lives easier, it usually didn't get adopted. And that was one of the hard lessons we learned, which took a lot of mistakes, 1,000 mistakes that we made. Simply saying it, thou shalt do this, doesn't mean it's going to get done. People don't like it, they leave your organization, right? Or they don't think it should be done that way, they won't do it that way. And then you have a choice, what do you do? So I think we certainly learned a lot, through that process, but it's moving from local excellence to enterprise excellence, I think is the important lesson we learned there, and the enterprise services. So hopefully that answered your question.
Absolutely. So we have like negative minutes left, but we did receive a question from one of our colleagues from another working group, and I'm going to address it to you, Robert, and then David, if you want to chime in. So the question is, what do you do beyond preventative tools to address the growing amount of open source software in the federal government supply chain? Robert.
Yeah, I think, certainly understanding what you have. So getting all your dependencies mapped. So there are some commercial tools, we'll keep names out of it. There are, some minimal open source. Unfortunately, this is a weak spot in the open source tooling. But you do need to get your arms around what you're using today and have a very focused effort. It doesn't have to take weeks or months. We've done this exercise on open source projects. You can do it in a couple of concerted weeks, depending on the size of the platform or the project. But you do need to do that first foundational step to understand what you've got, because from there, you're going to find that a lot of it is legacy that you no longer need. So applying lots of tools and scanners on, arguably 50% of your code that you're no longer using is going to be a waste of everyone's time. So I guess that would be my first recommendation. Then you have to look, a lot of these answers have been discovered already. So you don't have to look at a blank sheet of paper and try to construct something de novo. I will mention there's a framework Google had released called SASA, SLSA. It also has kind of maturity overlays. So you can do SASA 1, SASA 2. It gives you a good framework to look at. You can start thinking about your pipeline, your source code, the build process, and some of these topics that we've talked about, the provenance and the security of both the users and the interdependent libraries. But I think you have to have a plan. You can't just kind of wing it as you go. I think that would be my strongest recommendation. Just sit down and put something down on paper, even if it's an outline. It's going to go a long way in scaffolding what the next steps are.
David?
Yeah, well, outside of helping with the code and providing services, we started using user behavioral analytics on the development community, and the reason we did that was to align to more of a zero trust model for the code and the data and the access. So why is this developer accessing this library? It's not part of his software bill of materials. Why is he looking at it? Why did he check it out? Or should he have rights to it? And so it's, rather than giving every developer rights to everything, only give them rights to what they need. And then if they go outside those behavioral, assignments, if you see them doing things like sending screenshots of source code through email, you can ask questions, and stop that activity. And once we deployed this, we found all kinds of strange activity, to be honest, and then sometimes there were really legitimate reasons why they were doing things. Other times, not so legitimate, right? And so you can deploy some of those techniques we use against our user community to the development community, and then get some better insights and do a better job, as Robert mentioned, not winging it, but setting up real build environments that are locked down, source code environments are locked down, artifactories that are locked down, that are controlled, through your process that adhere back to policy. I think those are probably the best things you can do.
Thank you both. This has been, for me, for sure, because this is what that podcast is for. It was actually for me. This has been extremely informative. I really do appreciate your insight and your sharing of what you're doing, your best, sort of your best practices. We're going to have more podcasts around this topic, and I'm definitely going to be inviting you both back to share more about that, because this is really important. And like Robert said, there's like layers upon layers that people need to understand. And so we, because we're writing a white paper about it, we really need to engage more in the community, find out what their needs are, so we can actually embed that into the white paper. So I thank you both for, one, being here and speaking your mind and representing your organizations. And I believe that's it. Thank you.